Hi everybody, welcome to our Media Research Group seminar today. Delighted to have with us some very special guests, Dr. Hazel Collie, who is not Mayes, that's her weekend alter ego, and Dr. Gemma Commane, both senior lecturers in the School of Media at Birmingham City University. Gemma is the author of the recently published Bad Girls, Dirty Bodies, Sex, Performance and Safe Femininity, which is a wonderful, wonderful title for a book. What was the publisher, Gem?
Bloomsbury.
And Hazel and Gemma have been working together on work on RuPaul, which is what they're talking about today, work on Drag Race, and they've co-authored work on RuPaul for the Celebrity Studies Journal and have presented at Acria Media and Gender Conference. And their talk today is titled All Routes Lead to RuPaul as Ultimate Winner in RuPaul's Drag Race. So I'm going to mute myself and disappear and hand over to you both. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Laura. So I'm just going to, as all of these sorts of things have to start off with, an apology about how appallingly I'm probably going to share my screen.
You're doing an awesome job.
Hopefully you can all see that. Is it? There we go. Okay.
You just need to spot it. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, cool. So back when Gemma and I first started working at BCU, which must be, oh, Gem, what is it, like 5-6 years now? One of the things we first started talking about was RuPaul's Drag Race. And we started off being quite fangirly about it in those conversations. Oh, I watch RuPaul's Drag Race, you watch RuPaul's Drag Race. Great. We've got something in common, kind of being quite positive about it and feeling that it was kind of bringing visibility to a particular type of culture that was really great and exploring LGBTQ plus issues in really interesting ways. But as often happens, I guess, when you're exposed to a particular media text for any amount of time, our relationship with the text changed significantly over this period between then and now. And we've increasingly become aware that we've sort of transformed from fangirls into critical bitches. I mean, we were critical bitches before as well, but specifically critical bitches about RuPaul's Drag Race. And so a number of things kind of began to bother us about the show. And I guess the work that we do has kind of moved very much from what we initially thought we'd be writing about, which was quite celebratory, towards something that's a little bit more critical about the positioning of the show, the format it takes, and also the figure of RuPaul itself. And although we're not talking about this here, I think it's a really kind of interesting methodological point in terms of thinking about when you're constantly exposing yourself to your object of study and the transformation that can happen, I guess, in your relationship with it. So also, as we go through this, we're very much aware of our position in the audience of this show. We know we're not perhaps its initial intended audience. We're very much, as women, cis women as well, part of the more mainstream audience that the show has come to appeal to. And we're always very aware of the fact that the things that we don't get or that irritate us might actually be partly because we're not in on some of this information and we're slightly outside it as well.
I think also as well, adding to that, you know, the kind of shifting of RuPaul from quite a I guess more of a local cultural practice to pop culture has brought these, brought a clashes of audiences together, and actually, are kind of, although we're kind of outsiders, we're also insiders too, because of being within, and RuPaul being a kind of massive pop cultural machine and being there in the mainstream discussions. So we're in and we're out.
Yeah, and I was actually just going to talk about that, Gem, but that's okay.
Sorry, dude.
So we do sometimes go into these things assuming everyone knows what RuPaul's Drag Race is, because become so obsessed with it, but I thought I'd give you a little bit of an overview of the show. So it is essentially, although it deals with something that seems quite radical, it is actually a very mainstream format. RuPaul's Drag Race is a reality TV show, a reality competition show, in fact. So although you wouldn't immediately put it with things like Great British Bake Off, it does kind of belong in that tradition. It's been running for, I think we're on season 13 now, Gemma, is that right?
Yeah, we are.
That's just started, with a huge number of spin-offs now. So a lot of different geographical spaces have their own versions of RuPaul's Drag Race. There's an all-star spin-off where previous winners competitors compete against each other, and various other spin-offs as well. When RuPaul's Drag Race started out, and this is what Gemma was talking about before, it was broadcast on Logo TV, which is an LGBTQ interest channel, and that's where it started out. I can't remember when, but in the last sort of 5 years, I think it shifted to VH1, which is where that kind of tension, I guess, between the different audiences of the show emerge. So it's broadcast by VH1 now, a much more mainstream popular culture channel, and you can also access it on Netflix. So it's gone from having quite a narrow viewing audience to being much broader, and appealing to a really wide range of audience members. So the show itself is a reality competition. Each episode follows a broadly similar format, as we might expect of that very kind of conservative television format. So it often starts out with a mini challenge, where the queens have to kind of do a bit of quick and dirty drag and then compete in quite a light touch exercise. And this is often what RuPaul, who is the host and the main judge of the show, uses to decide who's going to lead teams in the main challenge. They'll then go on to do a main challenge, and both the mini challenge and the main challenge tend to circulate around things that drag queens do in their day-to-day lives, or that they might be expected to be proficient at. Although, of course, those proficiencies are determined and then judged by RuPaul. So it's coming through RuPaul's filter. So you might have as a main challenge an acting challenge. They're amongst my favourites. I don't know about you, Gemma. Musicals, makeovers, and then something called Snatch Game, which is where the queens have to, what's the word? I can't remember words anymore. They have to dress up and impersonate a famous celebrity in the kind of RuPaul parody of, I think the game in America is called Match Game, and it's basically what we in the UK call blankety blank, I think. So they have Z-list celebrities in that show who are trying to help contestants win money, and the queens in Snatch Game dress up as those sorts of celebrities. There's often a catwalk where the queens have to demonstrate a certain look, and then at the end, the two bottom queens, determined by the judging panel, which is RuPaul and several kind of regular judges and celebrity judges as well. And then they lip sync for their lives. Lip syncing is a big standard of Drag Race. And then RuPaul decides who gets to Shantae, you stay, and who will be asked to sashay away. So if you haven't seen it, from my description, you might not have a full sense of how bonkers this program can be, the campery that goes on in it, the way queens also speak to camera. They're being filmed doing these challenges, but we have those moments of insight into what they're doing when they speak to camera, or when they're working in the workroom to create the stuff they need for their challenges, and when they're making up as well before the catwalk show. So I thought I'd show you a little clip to give you a sense of what this program is. I say that with great trepidation because I'm going to try to share a YouTube video now. So just bear with me. So this is from series 2 of the show. It's a photography challenge where queens are being asked to pretend they're kind of Southern belles from a film like Gone with the Wind, for example, but with added difficulties which will become apparent as you watch. So I think that gives you a sense of what they're being asked to do, but also laden with innuendo. And as the series goes on, the kind of enmity, I guess, between particular queens becomes apparent as well. So I'm going to go back to sharing this other screen. So in a nutshell, that is what RuPaul's Drag Race is. This is a kind of overview of our journey here. So this would be me and Gemma back 5 years ago, thinking about how much we loved RuPaul's Drag Race. This is what I spend my time doing in the moments at the moment between meetings and teaching and research stuff, and I find it helps to keep me sane. And then this is what we kind of move towards now. And this is the sort of stuff we're writing about, although not necessarily talking about today, but these are the things we're hoping to develop into a kind of book proposal on the subject. So essentially, what we're going to be thinking about today, what we became interested, what we moved towards as we developed a more critical viewing relationship with the show, are a number of aspects which started to bother us. So firstly, the idea that there's a lot of academic work on this show beginning to emerge. And we noticed that at the beginning, although this persists, there's a kind of, I guess, necessarily celebratory approach to the show in terms of the kind of visibility it gives to a community that has perhaps been hidden in the past. But we felt that it's often not critical enough. And leading on from this, the figure of RuPaul himself or herself, who's obviously absolutely central to this particular programme, is often left out of any of the pieces of work that attempt to be more critical of the show as well. So despite his looming presence, he's kind of not there in the academic literature.
And I mean, it was quite interesting for us, wasn't it, around that kind of the lack of critical examination of Ru as a central figure, and actually through viewing 10 series and doing a kind of a textual analysis of different points within the show, themes came up that really highlighted Ru as someone that we had to interrogate, particularly around areas around commodification, around authenticity, and also about history as well. Some of these themes that were kind of highlighted in our kind of data collection, that although the other kind of academic debates were kind of engaging with RuPaul's Drag Race in terms of, like Hazel was saying, in terms of it's being something to celebrate, there were issues as well around issues of Black queens being quite stereotyped, and white queens being the types of queens who were more successful. So there's a lot of kind of things that we could unpack as problematic within this text, media as RuPaul as a media text. But for us, definitely seeing RuPaul as untouchable both within the show and within academic literature was something we wanted to interrogate. And we kind of laughed to ourselves, thinking, when we write this paper, do we need to kind of go under pen names?
Yes, because we have taken some heat, haven't we, for being women writing about this show as well, when articles that we've written have gone through review. So we did talk about that. And I think ultimately, Gemma, do you think it's fair to say that the main thing that bothered us was that this is a show that purports to be a platform for America's next drag superstar, but actually through the way it sort of commodifies the hard work of the queens who are on it, and also really exploits them in the way that a lot of reality TV shows do, to essentially further the career of RuPaul, to rejuvenate the career and kind of remind us that RuPaul's there and has this huge back catalogue of work. That, I think that was the thing that kind of really bothered us. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about commodification and RuPaul as a brand, and a lot of the show commodifies elements, like Hazel said, on LGBTQ culture. This includes drag, its history. The history will be something that we'll be talking about in a little bit. And supposedly radical politics. Vesey and Monroe criticised RuPaul on commodification, specifically around gay culture, and how RuPaul's celebrity is actually far removed from radical queer politics. So she's actually quite a influential queen with a lot of cultural capital, and a lot of the queens who come onto the show who can't come onto the show because they do drag in a way that doesn't fit within RuPaul's standard, are kind of pushed to the side. So again, RuPaul as a kind of figure of transformation and radical politics is something that has been criticised, and we kind of criticise her further. And we can see kind of the commodification of LGBTQ culture and Ru being the ultimate queen through templates used on the show, particularly around the maintenance of fame and pop stardom. So pop stardom kind of pops up quite a lot within RuPaul's Drag Race, around her back catalogue always being referenced in the show, the queens wanting to be on the music video, which we'll explore in a little bit. But all of these things, all these kind of points within the show, key milestones, etc., reinforce this idea of success. And in order for queens to be successful, they need to kind of pass these key milestones in order to be closer to RuPaul, closer to being that you know, the queen that's being crowned as the America's next drag superstar. But actually, when we're thinking around the measurements of success, these measurements are always decided by Ru, or in comparison to Ru as ultimate queen, always giving kind of words of advice, being the mother figure, setting these challenges, setting the standard, really highlights that RuPaul as a brand is the ultimate commodity, the ultimate queen that you know, the contestants on the show can't really reach or get to. But fame is really interesting within the show, particularly with milestones on the show like the Snatch Game, which we can see on the screen to the left or the right, depending on how you're looking at the screen. Queens have to make their drag marketable for a non-queer audience. So a lot of the kind of key milestones within the show, like the makeover, different kind of maxi challenges, the ways in which queens present themselves, and we're going to talk about in a bit how disclosure kind of works with that, make queens quite relatable and marketable to a non-queer audience. And fame, again, is through the parameters of the reality format, but also RuPaul herself and the format of RuPaul's Drag Race in terms of format. Queens wanting to become part and parcel of Ru's history, part of her stardom, part of her success. And the repetition again of certain challenges throughout the you know, the 13 series really puts into focus that, you know, in order to be a successful queen, you've got to be able to lip sync, you've got to be able to pass you know, the Snatch Game, you've got to be quite memorable and give a memorable performance. So again, these kind of expected notions of success are kind of measured by RuPaul herself. And again, queens can benefit from, you know, fame from the show and being successful in challenges and their perceived closeness of RuPaul, but actually when we're looking at it, RuPaul is actually untouchable, and no one can really come close to her, because again, she's deciding who is going through to the next show. She decides who wins from the lip sync battle. She decides, going forward, who she feels is the kind of ultimate winner of the show.
Yeah. That RuPaul ultimately becomes the gatekeeper of who is allowed to be aligned with this brand, I guess.
And quite interestingly, with the RuPaul Drag Race brand, the framing of success, achievement, and marketability again is kind of framed through pop stardom, through the RuPaul kind of pop video, the yearly pop video that she does with the winning queens, but also through reality TV. What's interesting about the brand and exposure, and the fact that there's spin-off shows as well, that RuPaul is actually quite portable. And again, in terms of RuPaul's latest song, it's mainly beneficial, yes, to some queens to some extent, but mainly for RuPaul, and it further endorses more of RuPaul's products and back catalogues, which she talks about during the show as well, mentioning iTunes, or mentioning particular brands that she likes that have a kind of stake within the show. And as also the format has matured, RuPaul's Drag Race has All Stars, a UK version that Hazel was kind of exploring and explaining before, and all of these exist as a promotion for the tour as well. So when we're thinking of RuPaul's Drag Race as a TV show, as a reality TV format, the brand exists beyond the show. That the brand is RuPaul. It's the show, it's the tour, it's RuPaul's drag, it's the videos, it's everything else. And although the queens are part and parcel of that success, their labour continues RuPaul as the ultimate queen. And again, the finale offers to the show, every year, the finale opens up kind of other touring opportunities for queens, but also for RuPaul and her portability of her fame, her cultural kind of capital, and her kind of being the ultimate queen, I guess. And again, all of this says, reminding us of the existence of RuPaul.
Yeah. And as it's become, I guess, as it's gained a foothold and a position in a more mainstream viewing environment, it's kind of opened that brand up to a whole new audience as well, which has ultimately, I think, been very useful.
And it's really interesting as well with the kind of, the growth of the brand, and RuPaul saying for queens to really work the camera, or to really know what they, to understand their self-identity, they need to kind of sell themselves constantly. And in the earlier kind of seasons, when queens were first introduced on the first episode, it was quite slapdash in terms of how they were introducing themselves. But as the series has gone on, and as it's kind of become even more mainstream in terms of the audiences, the queens have, the way that queens come on to and introduce themselves in the very first episodes is really kind of business-like. Isn't it, Hazel? That there's a full change to the kind of ways in which they frame who they are as queens.
Very slick and real kind of sound bites, which very, very quickly act as a shorthand to who they are. And as the show has become bigger, has given a greater platform to drag, it does feel as though drag queens have started thinking more about that idea of branding before they get to this show. Whereas in earlier series, it felt as though that perhaps occurred to queens and their development while they were there. So it's been really, the show has been very important in that respect. But of course, increasingly, as you see those queens coming in with more of an awareness of what they might have to do in the show, and you realise that for some of these younger queens coming in, the show itself, it's been running for 13 years now. Some of these queens are really young, you know, they're barely 20 years old. This show has actually been their first experience of drag. So it begins to kind of it begins to kind of, I think, create its own velocity, I guess, in terms of how successful it is and how it kind of begins to steamroller other types of drag and ways of doing it as well.
And I think that, you know, comes on to another area that we thought was, you know, really important, was around this kind of steamrollering of queer history as well, that RuPaul kind of does too.
Yeah. So so shall I pick up on that, Gemma?
Yes, please, Hazel.
Okay. So obviously, as a show with a long history itself now, 13 years is quite a long time for a series to run. It's kind of given itself this interesting role in that it both leverages the existing LGBTQ plus and drag histories that exist, but it's also kind of now become part of that history towards the end, in the more contemporary period. And over the development of the show, we also begin to see how it becomes aware of that and starts to promote the history of itself too. So the role of history is really, I think, important. It's really significant in drawing together wider LGBTQ plus histories with RuPaul's own positioning as a legitimate central figure to those events within the context of both the show, but also the wider popular culture that it grows out of. And over the course of the different series that we're watching, history becomes manipulated as the show format matures, as it becomes more mainstream, and it begins to engage with that mainstream audience as well. And this is kind of problematic because in terms of the way RuPaul, and I'll talk about some examples later, sort of co-opts LGBTQ history and decides what makes it into the show and what doesn't, RuPaul becomes the filter for interpretation of those narratives and her own place within them. And it's really kind of doing this has offered RuPaul the opportunity to revitalize and also expand her persona. So through reiterating her own history, aligning it with the wider history of the drag, and using the show constantly as a means of demonstrating where he fits into these key moments and key cultural things that have happened, it kind of offers him the opportunity to create legitimacy and authenticity. And it kind of puts him in a position of being the spokesperson almost for drag at the moment, the ultimate spokesperson for it. So Erin Bell and Anne Gray, in talking about television and history on television, all these various things, talk about this way that historical events can be manipulated through representation and narration. And they point out that this is particularly, I guess, problematic when we're dealing with television shows who have audiences which may not have access to other versions of that history. So what's coming through this particular television show is the only narrative of that history they're receiving, because it means that that becomes the history in their mind. And so it kind of almost becomes history in that respect without nuance. And we could point to the kind of increasingly mainstream audiences of the show and recognise, and when I'm talking about mainstream kind of heterosexual cis audiences of this show, they may not have access to, awareness of, or even be interested in finding out more about those histories. So RuPaul very much becomes that filter. And we can kind of see this happening in the show right from the very beginning, actually, although it increases as the show matures. So a big part of the earlier shows, particularly and later, is kind of creating an alignment between RuPaul and what is happening on this show with, for example, the documentary Paris is Burning, which looked at the drag community in New York in the 1970s. And this show, RuPaul's Drag Race, very much tries to kind of recreate some of the staples of drag which originated out of that particular culture. So we see throughout the show regular mini challenges, such as the library is open. This is where queens are encouraged to read each other. They read each other for filth, which means they basically, sometimes hilariously, sometimes it's very cringe making, they kind of poke fun at each other and elements of each other's characters that they might prefer to keep covered up. I know, Gemma, that the library is one of your favourite bits.
Yes. Can't do it myself, but
yeah. I don't know, I think you're quite good at reading for filth, Gemma. But even the catwalk challenge that kind of comes at the end of each series is very much a throwback to Paris's burning and its depiction of drag during that time. So it will be category is, I don't know, a night of 1,000 Madonnas or something like that. And that's the kind of theme that the queens have to dress up as. And that kind of catwalk category thing very much comes from Paris's burning as well. And RuPaul kind of makes direct links between what they're doing in this show, what she's doing in this show, with what happened in that documentary. And RuPaul constantly kind of ties herself into this past heritage of drag, and it's a very particular heritage of drag that comes from Paris's burning that RuPaul's trying to tap into by demonstrating to the contestants her kind of experience, personal experience and expertise of that time. So for example, in series 5, a contestant, Alaska, in the Snatch game, says that they're going to impersonate Lady Bunny. You can see in the top image here with RuPaul, that's Lady Bunny, who was a big figure during that kind of period of history that RuPaul's trying to create. And Lady Bunny, when they say they're going to impersonate, Alaska, when they say they're going to impersonate Lady Bunny, RuPaul's first instinct is, are you sure? Lady Bunny's hilarious. I've never met anyone as funny as Lady Bunny. It's very much about putting Alaska in their place. RuPaul knows this person that they're going to impersonate, that they think is a big enough character and celebrity for them to impersonate on this show. And even back in season 1, one of the challenges asks the queens, who are contestants in that series, to create an advert for a MAC line of makeup. And RuPaul kind of points to the fact that she did this back in, I don't know, the 80s, I think it was, with the MAC Viva Glam campaign, making it very clear that she was the first drag queen to do this, and to date one of the few who has. So constantly kind of reiterating their claim to that historical legitimacy. And increasingly, as the show matures, it begins to use its own history as part of the show as well. So in season 8, it starts with a 1-minute montage to mark the 100th episode, including what it sees as absolutely key, iconic moments for the show in this montage, all kind of put together. And for regular viewers, kind of harking back to stuff they'll be familiar with. Season 10 does a similar thing to mark 10 seasons. It has a very kind of celebratory season, in fact, to demonstrate how many successful queens have come through it. So we get through throughout the series a number of previous winners and big stars of the show coming back to judge particular moments and to give advice to the queens as well. And this serves to remind us that these big names in drag, although not as big as RuPaul, owe their platform to the show and implicitly therefore to RuPaul as well. So their success is very much bound into the show through the way they're kind of co-opted into the history of the television programme. So through RuPaul's knowledge and co-option of that history and personal experience of those histories, RuPaul places herself as central to LGBTQ plus culture, struggle, and general being historically, but through commemoration, that's what I'm trying to say, of the show itself, RuPaul kind of positions herself as the ultimate queen as well in a contemporary setting by placing RuPaul's Drag Race, her vehicle, as such a significant part of drag's recent history too. And now on to perhaps, I think, unless you've got anything to add, Gemma, sorry, I just absolutely banged through that.
No, absolutely. I mean, absolutely spot on there. And I think, with RuPaul using their age as well, or saying to younger queens, oh, you don't know anything about X show or this particular Hollywood superstar back in the 1950s.
Yes.
You don't know who those are. So again, putting them in their place, but also cementing RuPaul as always been there.
Yeah. And often the contestants are young, and older queens often don't do very well in the show because they're got rid of quite quickly.
And kind of carrying on with the whole kind of RuPaul benefiting across the format is the area of disclosure as well. So for those who haven't really seen the show, disclosure is when, well, particularly when queens on the show, contestants, they reveal something about themselves, their history, their identity. So kind of trauma stories that are carefully mapped out throughout the show, through particular points when queens are putting on their makeup in the mirror, so when they're disclosing to each other about HIV status perhaps, or partners dying, or being or having to have a chosen family because of biological family kicking them out on the streets. So there's a lot of these trauma narratives that are invited. I mean, the reality TV format invites that too. However, it's quite interesting how strategic it is within RuPaul's Drag Race, and how it's part and parcel, disclosure is part and parcel of how queens also, or the show allows queens to get authenticity through disclosing their stories, first of all in the mirror next to other queens, also when they're directly speaking to audiences in mini clips, commenting on other queens or parts of the show. You get queens talking to camera, so they're disclosing directly to the audience, directly to looking at you in the face. And also thirdly, disclosure about stories and their lives is something that happens within when they're being critiqued on stage by Ru and the judges, and also the audiences are invited into that space of disclosure. And the reveal of the disclosure is another way of furthering the RuPaul brand, particularly as RuPaul is seen to be a mother figure, and providing a platform where queens can share their stories in a safe space. And one of the queens, I'm just going to try and find the quote, bear with, I had it a minute ago, but it's fine. Yeah.
What is it, Gem? I'll try and find it while you're talking.
It's when one of the queens talks about how it's a platform, RuPaul being a platform for telling stories, and how that is really important.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, queens can benefit from this to some extent by disclosing stories that bring audiences closer to them, to make them more memorable as well. And again, when we're looking at kind of celebrity culture and the reality TV format, disclosure and emotion is a significant element in audiences feeling empathy towards or becoming fans of micro celebrities, or the girl next door type of celebrity. So we found that quite an interesting kind of aspect in that way. And also there's this idea of authentic disclosure within RuPaul's Drag Race itself, and then relating it to success, and this idea of disclosure and realness, being real. And being a drag queen, a lot of the queens across the series talk about how realness is something really important for you to bring to the stage. And Bianca Del Rio, talks about how important it is about kind of disclosure and being real, because that gives audiences an idea of how authentic you are, how you're not just about the drag being authentic, but also you as a person, as a celebrity, as well. And, you know, again, disclosure carefully is placed throughout the episodes and across series as well. And this draws you closer to some participants more than others. So disclosure is also used as a platform by the show, by RuPaul, to elevate some queens over others as well, in terms of their exposure to fame as well. And disclosure, again, operates in various modes: the workroom, queens talking about themselves, the remaining queens given themselves advice as well to their kind of past childhood selves. So in one of the final episodes, RuPaul asked the kind of the final three queens to give advice to their child, to them as children. And so you see on screen a kind of childhood picture of the queen, and she has to give herself advice. So again, RuPaul gives space for queens to reveal their true self over lunch, over a Tic Tac, during a moment where RuPaul says, okay, you know, please, well, she didn't say, please give me your trauma in exchange for this Tic Tac, but it's more or less that they're being rewarded.
I think, yeah, she might as well.
Yeah, she might as well. But this idea of disclosure as self-branding is really important in terms around authentic self, becoming identifiable with people and the RuPaul brand, but also beyond it too. But quite interestingly, although the queens really like to have that space where they can talk about emotions, to talk about, and quite rightly so, to kind of discuss to a mass audience what it is like to be a queer person, what it's like to be kicked to the curb, what it's like to experience multiple traumas. You know, those the sort of things that we're not questioning here. We're not questioning the Queen's kind of disclosures in that kind of sense, because it's a really important space for them to tell their stories, despite it being quite mediated, and despite when these stories get quite intense, the show then cuts to something quite fun and frivolous.
Yeah.
So as an audience, you forget about that trauma because the show's not about that. It's kind of about that, and RuPaul saying, I'm the savior of a lot of queer culture. I'm praised by Oprah Winfrey and other big celebrities of spreading tolerance. And although it's good to have these stories, it is kind of mediated in very particular ways.
I think what's interesting as well in the kind of frame of this show is that in drag culture there's a big thing about drag mothers. So those are kind of older queens, more experienced queens, who will often take younger queens under their wing and give them the family, the family that they don't have in terms of their immediate family. And throughout the show you often see, in terms of the disclosure, when the queens are kind of talking about trauma they've experienced and those bad experiences, the show kind of tries to frame RuPaul as this kind of drag mother, and some of them refer to her as Mama Ru. But the truth is, it actually feels quite exploitative, in that Mama Ru is kind of it's like some sort of, I don't know, horrific stage mother who's pushing their kids to do these things in actually quite a cold, exploitative and unkind way sometimes as well, because RuPaul never gives anything in return. Throughout the show, RuPaul rarely discloses anything. So he creates these spaces where the queens are kind of pushed to disclose things about themselves for entertainment and exploitatively. But I can think, Gemma, of maybe 2 occasions across 13 series where RuPaul's actually kind of disclosed anything.
Just about kind of
life.
yeah, just about kind of being poor.
Yeah.
In some, but then, there's a lot of, and again, like Hazel was saying, the queens just absolutely, talk a lot about, well, disclose a lot, but whenever RuPaul has done, and quite rarely so, it's very contained, very well controlled.
Very controlled.
And picking up the kind of drag mother, RuPaul is also seen as a mentor as well, so someone that you can kind of be inspired by, or someone that not necessarily would divulge anything, because they're at a stage where they won't disclose, because they've gone beyond that, and they're mentors, they're experts, and it's really interesting because some queens don't see RuPaul as a mentor or a drag mother, particularly Pearl, as she was saying that she doesn't see RuPaul as a mentor because she only is a mentor when the cameras are rolling. So beyond that, there's been a lot of kind of discussions around RuPaul not really caring for queens if the camera's not rolling.
And there's quite a lot of that has come out, I think, in kind of associated paratexts and things like that about the show.
And I think as well, RuPaul does mentor queens throughout all the seasons, but this cements the RuPaul brand. And again, disclosure, RuPaul's Drag Race being a space for creativity, for folk to promote charisma, nerve and talent. Have I missed one out there? I think I have.
Charisma, uniqueness, nerve,
That's
and
talent. All of this maps back into the measurements of success as directed by RuPaul. And again, the mediation of disclosure also highlights that Ru is always making the decisions. I mean, RuPaul is a great capitalist. Wonderful how they've made this massive machine of RuPaul's Drag Race, the Werk the World Tour, particularly when we're thinking about disclosure at the end of the kind of series. We're saying that queens are sharing their very intimate stories, and at the end of the show also you kind of see that RuPaul's Drag Race isn't just the show, it's the tour as well. And again, we were saying towards the beginning of the discussion that RuPaul's Drag Race as a TV show is a promotional platform for the tour, and again, disclosure of the drag queens again cements them as being very memorable. And also when you're thinking about tours and wanting to see someone live, it's not necessarily about the drag that you're perhaps as an audience member of a particular artist that you're loving. You love their backstory, you love how they are, you love that they've been the underdog and actually won from a range of queens. And again, that idea of the underdog is something that's capitalized upon and part and parcel of how success is maintained by RuPaul and the brand. And
I suppose really, Gemma, that would be our kind of conclusion to this, really, wouldn't it? That there's this kind of show which claims to be doing something quite radical in terms of visibility for a culture that's perhaps been overlooked in the past. So it's claiming to do that. It's claiming to give a platform to other people to progress. And it does, they do. People can do very well out of just being on this show, really. But ultimately, the whole show, although it's showcased as this caring place of safety, is actually anything but, and it's all kind of very much designed really to promote RuPaul and to remind people that RuPaul exists, and to make RuPaul still seem relevant, I guess, in the 21st century. So it's all about the money, like everything seems to be.
All the dollars.
All the dollars. So I think we'll stop talking now. So Gemma, you may leave the stage, and so may I.
If we were lip syncing for our lives, who would win, do you think?
I don't think we should even go down that route.
Maybe Laura could decide on that.
I for one would love to see that. I'm ever so sorry, I don't quite know what happened at the beginning. I turned my video off, but my face just kind of froze in an alarming vision, so apologies that everybody had to look at that for a while. I wasn't able to do or see anything except my own face for 25 minutes, but I could still hear you. So I'm going to turn my video back on. If I do happen to crash, I apologize profusely, and we'll all just come straight back in. It's just fingers crossed.
At least you didn't do that thing that I read about at the very beginning of the first lockdown, where that woman who was running a meeting accidentally put a potato filter on her face and then couldn't get it off and had to do the whole 1 hour meeting as a potato.
Oh, we should have done that.
I did see footage of that. Thank you so much, Hazel and Gemma, for a fantastic and fascinating talk about RuPaul. I would like to open this up to questions. If people haven't, Mike is straight in there. Hey, Mike, you're muted.
Oh yeah, I don't have to go first, but I just want to say thank you so much to both you, Hazel and Gemma, for doing this presentation. It's great. Huge RuPaul fan. First time season watcher. I'd say it's fantastic. And the first thing I'd say is you express some anxiety about being they used all the fantastic terms, but being straight women criticizing RuPaul, please go ahead, go nuts. It's perfectly welcome. Lots of people are doing it, and there's good reasons for that. Not the least of which is that first of all, RuPaul presents herself as this perfectly amazing person, but actually has a huge ranch which she fracks.
Yeah,
it has a fracking industry. Most of her money comes from fracking. So having said that, love RuPaul, love her to bits. But don't be afraid of being like whatever we said, cis hetero women, blah blah blah, whatever. Don't worry about that. I don't think it's a problem. I'd say also
maybe not for you, but for some it has been.
Yeah, but they're wrong, I think. I think also one of the things that speaking in favor of RuPaul, and I suppose this is a question I could actually ask, is that RuPaul has endeavored to put the alternative into the program and the associated programs. First of all, establishing, about halfway through the seasons, Michelle Visage is a permanent judge, because Michelle Visage is actually the only person in any of the shows who's actually was in Paris is Burning. And when they released the reissue of it, they show this footage of Michelle Visage actually at the ball. And at that point in RuPaul's career, I think she'd already shot, if it hadn't already come out, the B-52s video. So at that point, she was too big to actually go to a ball like that where she would have been inundated. And in addition, she was also criticized by the gay community at that point. In 1989, she was also a target for the gay community because she charged too much for her shows for New York gay bars to be able to afford her anymore. So, there's a lot of things around RuPaul that have traditionally gone on. So I'd say that with it, but I'd say the lasting thing I'd like to throw at it is how there have been alternative people who've managed to stay in RuPaul world and make themselves multi-millionaires and still hang on. And I would encourage people to watch the YouTube show, we're all watchers. It's called, spelled UNHHH, and it's Trixie Mattel and Katya Zamolaknova. And they are now New York Times bestsellers. They had a New York Times best-selling book. And they basically critique RuPaul and actually show an alternate way to be.
They're absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, and the last thing I wanted to say was there is an interesting kind of pressure that has happened since in queer world. I came up in the queercore scene. And it was because I felt like when I was a kid, gay bars had nothing to speak to me about. And so I liked punk rock, I liked Nirvana, and none of that kind of sort of the gay disco thing spoke to me. So, we had slogans like a lifetime of listening to bad disco is a high price to pay for one's sexuality. And there's a kind of alternate world now coming up out of that, out of the result of the reaction to RuPaul, that is really interesting. And you see it in East London, you see it in bars and discos and things around the world, of people kind of looking at RuPaul and then going, oh, that's okay, but we want something different, something more inclusive. RuPaul, at the insistence of the BBC, no longer uses terms like fish and stuff like that, which are really offensive terms. And drag is not innocent. You know, when I first started going to drag shows, the amount of drag queens who said really racist jokes, rice queens and this kind of stuff, you know, and a lot of that's been smoothed out. But anyway, I digress. I'm taking up the floor. But yeah, I encourage you. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your thoughts on Dragula? Have you watched?
I have. The production values are the thing I can't get through. My husband is here laughing because he can hear the production's value leave something to desire. But yeah, it's a great show and really interesting stuff.
But again, there's kind of different bodies, different kind of gender identities, different forms of drag on there that wouldn't be seen on RuPaul.
Absolutely. If people are interested in that kind of drag, then I really encourage you to head out once we can head out again on a Tuesday evening, and I'll bring you all with me to Club Whatever at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern on a Tuesday evening.
Oh, fabulous. Drinks on you then.
One.
I think what Dragula does definitely is hold up a mirror to how narrow the conceptualization of drag is on RuPaul's Drag Race. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. I have a question from myself, but if anybody else would like to think of some questions, that would be grand. So what really struck me in your abstract, you mentioned about how kind of previous work has been really quite a positive in terms of how it's examined and analysed the show. And what I thought was really interesting was, you know, obviously you're talking about how these queens' measurements of success are kind of decided by Ru, and it's not just as if Ru's just the gatekeeper of that kind of cultural aspect. There is also a question of like immaterial labour and exploitation there as well. So in terms of them winning a spot in this pop video, in terms of some of the kind of promotion and advertising that takes place within the show that you mentioned, and I wondered whether there had been any kind of further work about that kind of immaterial labour that you're identifying here, or whether much of what is out there is about kind of identity, audience engagement and fandom and performance and so on.
At this stage, I think, Gemma, correct me if I'm wrong, so at the beginning, it was very much, the work that was coming out was very much either about the tension between the very mainstream cultural object of reality television and the very radical thing that it was trying to present, but also at that time, it was also very much about identity. And identity has actually been the thing that continues to be written about. This idea of commodification is beginning to emerge a little bit as well. And I'm guessing from that idea of immaterial, of the labour that the queens are doing for the RuPaul brand, I think, which is one of the things we're hoping to work on, will emerge out of that idea around commodification. But the field is still very, very much about identity.
Yeah, and kind of tensions between kind of white queens and the issues of racism within RuPaul's Drag Race and poverty as well. And you know, speaking of like labour, in the beginning series, queens would usually come with or they would make their own clothes, or they would come more with clothes that, you know, they've kind of more DIY, and you could really see, and some of the queens would comment on how poor another queen looks, but actually from about season 7, 8, 9, I think it was it was a bit later than that. I think it was about 9 or 10 where the queens, when they first turned up into the workroom, and the costumes that they brought with them look really high end, whereas, you know, before, and again that could be a place where certain queens are not allowed access because they haven't got the kind of capital in order to kind of engage with that. So it really brings the question into, you know, what type, who is labouring, and actually who is having access to be able to labour for RuPaul is other privileged folk as well.
And who, when they get there, is having to do more labour to have the same output. Those are things that aren't necessarily being considered in relation to the show. And I understand why earlier it was framed in a very celebratory way, because I can see how it would feel like a huge achievement that a show like that could exist and then could become so popular that it was on Netflix and then it would transfer to this mainstream channel. It is a huge achievement, but I think in some of that earlier writing, some of the aspects that needed to be critiqued were overlooked because of that, and I think it continues to create a bit of a hole in the literature around it.
And I think as well with the literature around it, this is why a cultural studies interrogation of RuPaul is really important, specifically, and not dissing any celebrity studies folk out there, but there is a kind of particular canon where where arguments are framed within a really normative interrogation. And Hazel and I have come in with our cultural studies sledgehammer and thinking, actually, what can cultural studies bring to these debates? And actually what it's brought to the debate is bringing RuPaul from the periphery right to the centre of debates, and to also critique and hold into account popular culture. Because again, one of the things that kind of emerges from this paper and from the things that we want to do with this is kind of pop culture is a space that we've got to revisit. It isn't necessarily a space, kind of a space of possibilities, opens up space for stories to be told, but it's mediated in very particular ways. And again, commodity culture really has its hand in the mediation of success, what it is to kind of be successful, I guess. So again, cultural studies sledgehammer.
That's all we can do. All right, lovely, thank you. Cora has a question. Cora, you're welcome to turn on your mic and or camera. No, you'd need your mic otherwise, or just type. Sorry, that was
sorry, I'm actually on my sister's laptop. It's Andy McCormack here.
Hi Andy.
Hi, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
I just had a question to pick up on a point that you guys made very early in the talk about RuPaul's Drag Race's place in the kind of reality television ecosystem, and I wondered about how RuPaul centres himself as simultaneously the kind of facilitator and the product of the show, and how that speaks as a form of parody of maybe shows like The X Factor, and even to an extent, a lesser extent, but an extent nonetheless, things like the Great British Bake Off, where of course reality television makes a fortune for people behind the scenes. I mean, apart from Leona Lewis and Little Mix, I mean, Simon Cowell, who's the winner of The X Factor. And I wonder how much of that sort of structure of reality television, I mean, Donald Trump and The Apprentice, another kind of tragic example, how much of that sort of structured RuPaul is parodying, and, treading a very fine line between parodying something and actually participating in it. So, just thinking.
Well, thank you for that. I think, in terms of a kind of RuPaul Drag Race in the reality TV format, it does something slightly different to shows like the X Factor. And again, there's this very, kind of, it's not just about the money, it's not just about the next, kind of superstar. It's reaffirming RuPaul and recentering RuPaul as not just the ultimate queen, but the ultimate spokesperson for the queer community. So there's more going on within RuPaul's Drag Race within the kind of reality TV format. And although there is this kind of clever parodying of format, quite tongue-in-cheek, there are massive issues going on within the ways that RuPaul is benefiting from people's trauma, the kind of regurgitation of RuPaul's back catalogue as being, again, something that these queens need to kind of engage with in order to be successful, not to be successful within their own terms, but within the format of RuPaul as the ultimate queen. So it's not necessarily about just the format, but it's also about the role that RuPaul places herself, not just within the reality TV format, but indeed within popular culture itself. So we can't really just see kind of the format as being separate from those wider issues that are presented by popular culture, by by those kind of politics that are associated with that. I don't know what you want to add to in terms of that, Hazel.
I was just going to say, what's a bit different about RuPaul's Drag Race is, obviously, unlike those other shows, the very title aligns this with RuPaul. Like, those other shows make money for some of the people who are involved in it, but the shows aren't called, I mean, we all know it's basically his show, but it's not Simon Cowell's X Factor, or so it's kind of, the show is all about and structured around that central figure of RuPaul. And although I think it does parody elements of those shows, and it does it really well, I think at times, to me, when I'm watching it, one of my frustrations is it feels disingenuous, that parody, because it's like it's trying to distance itself from that. It's trying to say, oh, we're aware of that and we're not doing it. But in terms of how exploitative, I can never say that word, of the contestants, it's the most I've almost ever seen of that type of show, in terms of what it demands of its contestants to be in it and to do well. So yeah, sorry, I've just gone off on one. I don't know if I've actually answered your question there, but yeah, that's what I would add to what Gemma said.
Anything, Andy, did you want to come back on that at all, or are you good?
No, yeah, that was really helpful. I think I was just interested in, for example, thinking about the commodification of suffering and things like that, and how that's something that's central to, across the reality TV spectrum, and where those sorts of points of intersection are. And I wonder, the fact that it is RuPaul's Drag Race as opposed to Drag Race, and the kind of explicit, playful censoring of RuPaul makes it a bit less. I mean, I understand the critiques of RuPaul's kind of megalomania and things like that, but the fact is that RuPaul's always been in on the joke. Everyone's always been in on the joke, that everything's about Ru, and it's Ru that matters, and it's Ru's house that everybody's living in. I remember a tweet that Jinx Monsoon responded to questions from fans about, what's Ru like and things like that, and do you think that Ru's cannibalizing drag? And very succinctly, she just stated that there's a difference between drag and RuPaul's Drag Race, and that's a really fascinating area for exploring, which I really enjoyed your exploration of in your lecture. But just the kind of the starting point to get into that debate is that RuPaul is in the joke, and always has been. So just interesting to reflect on the sort of explicit censoring of RuPaul in the kind of parody of the format, that he's still exploiting them, but he's exploiting them with a big neon sign of what he's doing. A big arrow.
I think what's really interesting to me is, though, you've picked up on that when you watch it, you can recognize those things that are going on, but there's a big audience for this show now who this is what they know of drag. And they don't necessarily know all that information about RuPaul, or what drag is, or who does drag, or they're watching it as a reality TV show in many ways, perhaps not picking up on that parody. And I think that's a really interesting area as well. I think the tension between the audiences, well, it's not necessarily a tension, the difference between those audiences is something I find really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Andy. We've got a question from Louise Coopy. Lou, if you can type out, or you can join us, please.
Hi.
Yeah. Hello.
I was it was brilliant talk, by the way. I was just thinking about what you were saying about how like Mama Ru was perceived and the idea of family. It got me thinking about the differences between the US version and the Canadian version, because obviously RuPaul's not in the Canadian version, apart from obviously the name and the odd appearance, I think, at the start with videos. But basically how unequal the relationships are with RuPaul in all the other versions. And then you've got obviously Michelle Visage, Ross Matthews, Carson Kressley around her. And then in the other one, Brooklyn Heights and Stacey McKenzie and Jeffrey Bowyer Chapman are all kind of equal on it. They all vote the Queen off. They all have a vote towards the Queen that goes off. And also Jeffrey Bowyer Chapman came in for quite a lot of criticism for bitchy comments that wouldn't have been out of place coming from Michelle Visage in the other ones. So I was more thinking along the lines of sort of, what do you think about the differences between the dynamics? Have you thought about the differences basically, and what role Ru plays across?
Actually, to my shame, have not yet seen the Canadian version.
Oh, right, okay.
There just keeps being new iterations of this bloody show that I have to keep up with.
They've just started an Australian one as well, haven't they?
I know. And in fact, of the different international spin-offs, I've only seen the UK version so far. So I think, for me, I couldn't answer your question because I would just be pulling something out of the air to say it, but it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, again, around those kind of, the value between different kind of countries, different types of queens, and also whether those queens in Canada, have they performed in the US? What is that kind of, what is that dialogue? What is the cultural capital? But like Hazel was saying, we would be pulling an answer out the air there.
What is quite interesting though is on the US version, you do sometimes get Canadian queens because obviously they've crossed over the border and they're living in the States and performing in the States. So the relationship between those two shows is immediately interesting to me anyway.
It was quite different with the way that they the whole dynamic worked across the panel, I felt. I feel sometimes that the especially in the US version and in the UK version with Michelle alongside Ru there, I think the dynamic's quite like you say, Ru's always in the centre, but the dynamic kind of plays the same across both, whereas from my reading of it in the Canadian one, it played quite differently because they were all kind of on an equal footing in terms that they all had to vote off the Queen at the end of the lip sync, and they took it in turns to go into the workroom as well. So it's although it's part of the same family, the dynamic was a little bit different. So
I wonder also, why the decision to do that was made when they replicate that US one across all the other ones that I'm aware of.
Strange.
It was I don't, whether it's because Brooklyn was put in the center of that one, but obviously it's not the same really as having Ru in it. Also I'd just a comment that come back from the poverty angle. I just thought of it while I was listening to the last question. Monique Hart, in hers, she blamed being poor for being voted off early in season 10. It was the first thing she mentioned in All Stars 5 when she came back. She's got money now, so she can compete. So just thought of that while I was listening. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
And thank you.
That is, I think, another thing for us to watch, Gemma.
We usually have watch parties, don't we? Pre-lockdown with pizza and notebook.
So I went over it through lockdown, so and worked backwards strangely.
You just sort of backlog of things to watch.
Thank you.
Well,
thanks a lot. Victoria asked a question which very much overlapped with Lou. That she was wondering how you feel RuPaul's presence as the ultimate queen is negotiated in spin-offs like Canada's Drag Race, where Ru isn't a judge. I think that's probably covered it. But if you've got anything more specific, Victoria, please do let us know. Does anybody else have any other questions for our guests? I'm going to take that stony silence as a no. The stony silence is much weirder on in a call than it is in a room. At least you can see people going no.
I wonder if I could ask one more quick question.
Of course, Sandy.
just about if there's any specific contestants or any specific winners that you feel have, you know, helped to change directions that maybe Ru had foreseen the show going in, and if there's any sorts of points of intersection that contestants, I know you mentioned Pearl, sort of, you know, speaking out about the sort of emotional talk to your younger self segments, although it doesn't seem to have much effect, and repeating them with every finale. But I'm thinking about maybe sort of changes in aesthetic and sort of a broadening of the types of contestants the show was willing to cast after Sharon's victory in season 4 and things like that. If there's any sort of interesting points where you feel some of the sort of criticisms that you guys have been talking about have been addressed by contestants or personalities or even judges in the show. I'm thinking about you know, sort of guest judges when they sort of disagree with Michelle in particular.
I think, thank you for that. I mean, it's really interesting how, you know, queens like Sharon Needles have kind of changed the types of drag that have kind of been explored on the show. But actually, you know, when we're thinking of an example of Sharon Needles in season kind of, you know, 10, 11, 12, her sort of drag becomes staple, and there's this kind of commodification of the alternative, which is really interesting. The fact that, you know, things have shifted, or queens have shifted some of the dynamics of the show or the presentation of drag within the show, but how, again, how popular culture sucks in and mediates the alternative. It's really interesting at the moment with the series that's on now, where we have wonderfully our first trans contestant. What's his name? That the new queen. Can anyone?
Got Mick.
I don't know. There has been massive. That's it. Yes, there's been like a massive controversy around RuPaul being a transphobe.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see the longevity where first trans man it has been on the show, and the longevity of how long Got Milk will be on the show.
Yeah.
But also it got Hazel and I questioning, is RuPaul being quite tokenistic? You know, what type of trans man or trans woman is able to perform on that particular show? What about, you know, gender queer folk? What about, you know, a range of bodies, a range of gender presentations being on the show? Is there going to be, you know, even more radical change? And it's great again to have RuPaul's Drag Race responding to criticism by allowing the first trans man to be on the show. But it'd be interesting to see how how things will go.
And to be fair, the show itself has incorporated some of that discussion into it. So, for example, Peppermint came out as a trans woman on the show, which I guess adds to that discussion. And then is it Gia Gunn who was talking about her own kind of transitional journey as well, and All Stars. So, you know, it does offer space for these conversations, but it takes sometimes a while for them to play out. Yeah,
for sure.
So I think for me, for you know, the biggest transformation for the show, or the potential, is, you know, more space for trans folk to exist within the show, the visibility of it, and again, you know, different forms of drag as well. It'd be interesting to see the longevity of RuPaul's Drag Race as a show as well. You know, it's in the 13th season, and whether or not is RuPaul Drag Race as a show actually running out of steam? Yeah. What are the ways in which could RuPaul continue the brand of RuPaul? Is it necessarily this show? Can RuPaul's Drag Race actually just be the Werk the World Tour with different queens that have been selected but not on the show. Be interested to see the longevity of it.
Yeah, definitely. We have one last question just before we wrap up, from Victoria. Are queens announced as queens are announced for newer seasons? Fans often compare them to queens that have been on previous seasons. Is this something that you might consider in your research about Ru being the ultimate queen and winner?
Yes.
Yes.
It's the short answer.
Absolutely. And even as the queens come into the workroom, Victoria, for their first episode, in a lot of their "this is who I am," they're already saying as well, they're part of the house of, you know, Aja, or, you know, so they're already making those connections between themselves and previous contestants as well. So yeah, basically, that's absolutely one of the things we're interested in.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a really important point. We've got time for maybe one more if anybody else has anything, but I'm guessing not. Okay.
I have one last question.
Okay.
I have to go. I have to teach a class in 4 minutes. I suppose my question really is about how the show itself, forgetting the show for the second and the problems of it, but how has the show made it easily, particularly for Netflix and for some of those other streaming services, to have more queer characters, queer content on them as a result? And I wondered if that might be an interesting part of your research. Or direction, right? I don't know.
I suspect that's probably a whole thing in itself, actually. Yeah, and I don't know. I haven't particularly thought that through yet.
No, that's a really
Gemma,
good point to raise, isn't it?
Yeah, that's maybe our next thing. That's it. We're sorted. We're sorted for
Thanks, everyone.
28.
It's always good when somebody else does your next research plan. All right, well, on that note, thank you very much to our guests, Hazel and Gemma. Fascinating talk. Thank you to everybody who came along and for all your excellent questions. Wonderful talk. I'm sure everybody will agree.